Can you guys hear me? Hear me? Woohoo! Okay. Welcome to seminar, folks. Sort of focus in. Before we get going, I just want to check and see if anyone has announcements or questions on anything that we need to pick up. Alan.
Yeah, I sent out an announcement last week. If you would like to pre-register for any of the diving classes on fall semester, and pre-register before anybody else at MMA gets into those classes because they fill up fast, send me a note. I sent an email out. Please read that email. Send me the information. I will forward it to registrar's office. And hopefully you'll get in. All right? That's it.
Okay. Anything? Yes.
First-year students, I'm bringing out a card for all of you. So, if I miss you, please let me know.
Yes.
Next week is the Maritime Academy Climate Symposium. So that is going to run between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. You're not all required to stay for the whole thing, but I encourage you to. It's going to be a really great discussion. Earlier that day will be a lunch and learn at 12 p.m. For anyone not on a meal plan, you can get checked off and just go through the line. And that'll be held in Holmes Heritage Room. It's a chance for more informal discussion with the speakers that we'll have on campus. And then there will be a dinner at night that you're all invited to as well. So I hope you all can attend.
Everybody ready? Good? Good? Okay. I would just like to take a minute here to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Bill Needelman. Bill is the City of Portland's first waterfront coordinator, having started this position in 2014 after working for 14 years with Portland's Planning and Urban Development Department. In the position as waterfront coordinator, Bill provides project management, technical support, community relations, interagency coordination, and communications for waterfront project and planning processes. His portfolio includes a wide range of marine and waterfront initiatives, some of which he will be talking about this afternoon. Bill is a lifelong Portland resident, has a Bachelor of Science in Geology, yes, from Boston College, and a Master's in Community Planning and Development from the Muskie School at the University of Southern Maine. Bill's talk is going to focus today on the role of the port and the port professional in the community, and use case studies from the Portland Harbor projects to highlight the needs, advantages, and mechanisms for maritime industries to foster relationships and healthy interdependencies with host communities. For all of us here, this talk is a really good opportunity to be thinking about all of the different kinds of professional capacities for us as scientists and mariners to be engaging on waterfront and harbor issues. And with that, I'm going to turn the stage over to Bill.
Thank you, Karen. Can people hear me? Great. So the introduction that Karen most kindly provided to me did a pretty good job of saying who I am. I hope I can live.
Can you turn on? Are you?
I'm on. It's on. Can somebody pump up the volume, or I can use a different mic?
We could hear you earlier. Do you need to hold it?
Can people hear me now? Are we getting amplified? No.
It's on YouTube also, or like it's live streaming also.
Check.
Check.
There we go. It's green now.
Can people hear me?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. That's really loud. The talk that I'm going to give today is going to basically reflect what Karen just introduced, though it is a story that kind of grows and contracts with the telling. But this idea that the marine community and the marine economy and its upland neighbors, that relationship is something that I don't know that is terribly well explored in academic circles, certainly not in terrestrial planning circles, and I think very little in maritime education, which is why I really appreciate the opportunity to provide a few comments here. I'm going to try to wrap up my talk in about 35 minutes from where we are now. Folks are going to give me the hook, in advance of our time wrapping up here to make sure that there are plenty of time for questions and answers. As a way of introduction, how many people here know the city of Portland and or the port of Portland? All right, excellent. So here we are looking at the Portland Peninsula, and from a policy standpoint, we separate the Portland Peninsula and the Portland waterfront into eastern, central, and western. And it's important that we have these policies distinctions because the policies reflect property ownership patterns, but also water depth patterns. The type of vessel that uses each distinct portion of our waterfront is really what drives the policy that determines land use. Marine use, certainly, but municipalities pay attention to land use. And it's one of the disconnects that you are going to bump into as maritime professionals. Those folks who you need to work with on the land side speak a different language, they have a different set of rules, and they're not necessarily going to carry the same priorities that you do when you're each trying to go about your business. Doesn't mean any one of you is particularly bad or wrong, you're just talking different languages. So the fact that Portland has a policy framework based on water depth is due to the fact that the maritime community and the terrestrial community have talked with each other, and they've been doing so in an in-depth way for about 40 years. Because it matters. Planning is what we do to facilitate change anywhere. And usually that has a land-based framework. But you really need to know whether or not you are doing waterfront planning, which accounts for both the water and the land, or if you are just planning next to the water. Many of your colleagues who work in land use planning are not going to understand what's happening on the water. They're going to do planning next to the water, and it won't necessarily be waterfront planning. It's not their fault. It's just that they don't know the things that you know. But also, please recognize that you don't know the things that they know. Portland's waterfront policy is based on this graphic I put together back in 2007 to try to describe what we do to folks in Providence, Rhode Island. And I said, well, we have these 3 different types of uses. There's non-marine uses that we allow as long as they're compatible with marine use. There are marine uses that are not water dependent. They gain value from being near the water, and they add value to the water, say a fish processing plant or a ship chandlery, but they don't need to be on the water. And then there's the highest priority use, water dependent use, the boat berthing, fish unloading, those uses with wet feet. The city of Portland prioritizes those because we recognize that these other uses, non-marine uses and even marine-related uses that don't have wet feet, they can move. The water-dependent use can't, and therefore access provided to the waterfront use is incredibly important. I'm going to use a couple of different case studies to describe how some of these policy issues play out, and we're going to, and then I'm going to wrap up with some observations on communicating some of the issues that you as maritime professionals are going to need to communicate to your community partners on the uplands. The first case study we're going to use is the western waterfront, which, if we go back, is a deep water marine, industrial, and freight zone. And it's the waterfront port development zone is what we call it. And we rewrote this zone starting back in 2015 to 2017. And it was largely based on the fact that a new carrier came to town in 2013, AIMSKIP, North Atlantic leaders in cold chain logistics and container freight service to the North Atlantic, which now calls the city of Portland, the Port of Portland, home port for North America, for the United States. They also serve the maritime Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and Northern Europe. It puts Portland, Maine within an efficient transportation network connecting to the 300-odd million people of the North European market. So it's a very important transition for Portland to go from being the end of the line to being the gateway to the North Atlantic. But every white box you see on an AIM-SCIP vessel is a refrigerated box. They paint them white so they reflect heat. AIM-SCIP is big in frozen fish, pharmaceuticals, other seafood products. Frozen cold chain is a bread and butter for their industry. They needed a cold storage facility on the Portland waterfront. What we did not have is zoning that allowed for the scale of development that they needed. The blue box you see towards that angle point in the waterfront port development zone was a proposed cold storage facility that was going to be up to 75 feet tall. We only allowed 45-foot buildings. We didn't allow tall buildings because you have the highest value properties in the city right up above the port. And up until from the 1950s and 1960s through very recent memory, this entire area was basically vacant. To put a large building there required a change in zoning. Zoning follows policy. I described the policy earlier. But the zoning also needs to reflect existing uses, and we had boat yards, we have break bulk, containerized freight, and marine construction, but also a lot of fallow ground. It goes into an area that has been historically heavily developed. This is that same part of the waterfront back in the 1870s, 1880s, early 1900s, 1960s. It's going way downhill. This is a coal gasification place, tremendous amounts of environmental contamination. Coal gasification is one of the most notoriously dirty industries that literally can exist, producing carcinogenic coal tars. They use cyanides in the processing, many, many different environmental sins which you then need to account for in its redevelopment. And why do we want to redevelop it? I use this gentleman to describe to people why we need to redevelop and continue to develop our waterfront, because these folks need jobs. We need to foster our relationship with AIM-SCIP. We need to encourage export of Maine goods into the world economy, which also boosts food manufacturing. We need to support fishing and traditional industries, as well as the other industries that exist in the Western waterfront. These folks need jobs. Supporting the jobs is part of our comprehensive plan. Our comprehensive plan is where the policies live. And without having the policy work done up front, none of this would have been possible. And we do it for folks like these, the folks who work in seafood processing, who work in ship repair and boat repair, as well as those transportation uses. And we've been doing it for a long time. This poster, "Don't Take the Port Out of Portland," was from the 1980s, when a lot of these policies were developed. And taller buildings are intended to be an evolution of the work that we started back in the 1980s to really protect against gentrification, residential construction, and the kinds of access limitations that we're seeing up and down the Maine coast today, especially today. We wrestled with these same issues back in Portland 40 years ago. One of the things we had to do in order to convince our community that what we were asking for, taller buildings, was reasonable is see what other people do, including Belfast, Maine, Cincinnati, Ohio, many of the ports up and down. And what we found is we were on the short end. What we were asking for was not unreasonable. It was important to do this work. This was just a lot of internet work by myself, just to say to city councilors and to neighbors, we're asking for something reasonable. You don't know if what you're asking for is either reasonable or unreasonable until you do a little bit of legwork. And if you haven't done the legwork and someone asks you the question, what does Belfast do? If you don't have the answer, your conversation stops and you've got to go back and do that work. So it's worthwhile to spend the time to find out what are your colleagues and what are your competitors doing so that you know how you compare. Explaining the need for taller buildings is easier for some uses than others. You can't service a big boat unless you have a big shed. If your zoning doesn't allow for a big shed, you can't work on the big boat. And it's easy to describe in Portland why it would be important to be able to service ferries that serve Portland. We're really only trying to take care of our own marine transportation needs, our own marine economy needs, and that's why we'd be looking at taller buildings. So we went through a very long process, which I'm not going to describe, but essentially we met with a lot of people, some of them formally and some of them informally. And what we heard from the neighbors, and this is a look down from the West End neighborhood towards the site of the cold storage facility, is that they were afraid. They were afraid of what it would look like. They were afraid of parking impacts, traffic impacts. They wanted to protect working waterfront for working waterfront too, but they didn't think a cold storage facility necessarily was water dependent, and therefore they wanted to preserve land. Some of them wanted to preserve their views, but they used the term working waterfront preservation against the working waterfront. And so that was doubly important that we had those policies that describe in the pyramid how water-related uses belonged within the structure, why they were important for uses like AIM-SCIP. But the 850 people who signed a petition against the rezoning, and that's a big number, they weren't crazy, they weren't mean, they weren't stupid, and they weren't wrong. They just happened to have a different set of values. There were folks who supported it, including many in industry, certainly the marine economy, but also folks from other state agencies, and as well as folks outside of the marine economy who just understood that Portland was a port community and needed to support port uses. So we did a lot of studies. We mapped everything to within an inch of its life. We looked at comparative ports. We did a traffic assessment, economic assessment, a visual assessment, and then we asked everybody in the neighborhood to provide their input as well, and made sure that that was incorporated into the analysis. You can't ignore your detractors. You give them power by ignoring them. It's better to give them a job than it is to turn your back on them. Because when you give them a job, produce information for this analysis, they become part of an analysis and you build teams. If you ignore them, you build enemies. This is a map that I put together to try to describe to the neighbors who lived right up above this site, where's the elevation? Those colored lines are different elevations. The numbers were photograph spots that I took of the site so that they would understand what things looked like. And so they could find themselves in the plan so that they knew what the impacts would be. And this was my, putting the magic in magic marker, I did this for myself. I wanted to know what was the visual impact of this building on the neighbors. So before I went to talk to them, I already knew what it was going to look like, because this is very rudimentary drafting, taking a topographic map and turning it into a section drawing, putting on those little cartoon houses. But I can go to those people who lived in those houses and say, you're good, you're over the top. You're going to be looking at this thing, you should be concerned, come to the meeting, but we're still going to have a conversation. But then it's not enough. We put lift trucks on the site, on the corners of the building, at the building height. They said, but it's snowing and no one can see it. Well, that's why we take photographs, we do a little work with graphics, and we show the building from different vantage points. So if you're on Salem Street looking down over the site, yeah, you're going to look at it. We're not going to hide that from you. You build trust by describing the full impacts of development. Without that trust, these folks were never going to support you, but their counselors may support you if you have been honest with them. In this kind of demonstration, where that lift truck is barely visible, but you can then show them with absolute certainty, that's 75 feet tall, we measured it, here it is on site, that's going to be the visual impact of the building. But then you let the architects do it and they do it for real. And then the professionals get involved. And this looks very much like the drawing that I did, only it actually warrants a lot more trust because it's done with graphics that you can depend on. And then you show what things might look like on the bottom with actual development forms, buildings beyond cold storage. You show it in different ways. Not everybody can read graphics very well. So you have to show things multiple ways. Some people will read a spreadsheet, other people look at a photograph. These 3D renderings of what actual buildings may look like, along with their context, incredibly valuable in communicating potential impacts. This, again, this is of rendering, but it's so realistic that people trust it. And since it then compares to that lift truck diagram that we put out there before, it's been verified, and you're not just showing them things that look reasonable, you're showing them things that look accurate. We describe what the existing zoning looks like and what might be possible with the existing zoning. And then we put together a new zoning plan that reflected neighborhood concerns, including view corridors. People want to be able to see. These are the areas that would never be built just because logistically and practically there was never going to be buildings in these areas. But then when we went to the view corridor, when we went to the building height map, which is now, this is the regulatory framework that was passed, we build view corridors into the zoning so that they're guaranteed. And with these new zoning, with those new building heights, what we get are new building forms, new uses that support port activity, cold storage, boat repair, and hopefully in the future, additional facilities for bulk freight storage. And this is from just a couple days ago, me climbing up in the bushes to try to get a picture of, we did this process for cold storage. What we got was a whole new boatyard. The Portland shipyard did not exist 20 years ago. It barely existed 15 years ago. And now they're still putting up 75-foot buildings, big sheds for big boats. There is a 20-acre boatyard that would not exist if we hadn't done the work. We wouldn't have succeeded doing the work if we hadn't been straight with our neighbors and told them exactly what the impacts were going to be. And this is cold storage facility as it was just a couple of days ago. It's not quite open yet. It's just getting ready to open. And this potentially has the ability to unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in food manufacturing and food-related commerce for the state of Maine moving forward. There's no facility like this currently in the state. State-of-the-art cold storage attached to a marine facility where the carrier is a leader in cold chain logistics for the North Atlantic. It's a very big deal. Different project. All ports depend on berthing as a foundational resource for their function. If a port can't berth the vessel, can't serve the vessel, you're no longer a port. We have a dredging problem in Portland Harbor. And the CAD cell, a confined aquatic disposal site, was our solution for dealing with contaminated dredge spoils. So I'm going to use this as a case study to describe communication and how we communicate. First of all, you need to say who's doing it. And we have a lot of different partners working on the project, multiple municipalities, multiple state agencies, quasi-state agencies, as well as technical support and financial support. One important and unusual member in this list is the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA has what they call a brownfield redevelopment program, and our dredge project is the nation's first submerged lands brownfield, where we're looking at contamination underneath the surface of the water, using its cleanup as economic development. And that's where EPA came in, and it's an incredibly important tool for us. And it's noteworthy that in Maine, we are the first and as yet only dredge project that has been able to take advantage of EPA brownfields. We have to describe to people why we need to dredge. They don't get it. They don't understand. It's not their job to understand. But if they don't understand, they're going to make your lives miserable. Because they're going to ask why. Why do we need to do this? Why do you need to disturb that habitat? It's like, well, mudflats shed mud. And that mud ends up in the berth. If you show them a picture of sedimentation, they understand it. You can spend an hour trying to describe it, but if you show them a picture that they understand, they'll get it. And you may turn detractors into supporters. We've done it before. It's normal. This is a dredge of Portland's harbor back in 2014. Army Corps of Engineers, thank you Army Corps of Engineers, does a good job of working with communities to keep federal channels dredged. But if you are outside of a federal channel, Army Corps of Engineers is statutorily prohibited from working with you on your dredge. They are not going to fund you. They will make your life a living hell in the permitting aspects, but they will not fund you. But what the Army Corps dredge shows is dredging is normal. And you've lived through it before, you didn't even know it, you didn't notice it, nothing to see here, moving on. Because this kind of construction, where they moved 450,000 cubic yards of material back in 2014, and neither Portland nor South Portland had a single complaint, because it happens in the middle of the winter, and nobody knows it's happening, except for the people on the water. There are benefits that you need to describe, which are improved berthing. The new ledge won't have to sit in the dirt on extreme low tides, but it also provides a cleaner environment. We're taking contaminated sediments and we are finding an appropriate spot for them so that they no longer do damage to the environment. We also regain that berthing. The red areas in this graphic I put together, this goes back to 2010, so these numbers are way out of date. But the red areas demonstrated that we had lost over 25% of all the berthing in our central waterfront due to sedimentation back as of 2010. That's a big number. If we were to replace that 3,000 linear feet of berthing with new dockage, it would be hundreds of millions of dollars in order to construct. Dredging is the most cost-effective way to return that resource. And that resource supports an overall harbor economy of $1 billion a year. Most of us in here are Mainers. When we start to measure things with a B in Maine, you get people's attention. We only know this because we did this study, because people ask, why are we even bothering? We're bothering because it's $1 billion every year into our economy. And it's a significant amount of, a percentage of the state's overall economy can be traced back to harbor activity in Portland Harbor. It's that important. That's why we need to maintain it. Until you do the study, you don't know what it's worth. And if someone asks you what it's worth and you've got Cheerios in your mouth and you're mumbling, you lost the argument. You are not going to get your project that much farther closer to success. We talked about diverse employment. We used to be very concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our economies. Many of us still are. Certainly the counselors in the city of Portland are extremely concerned with the fact that of the 700 people that we identified working in food processing, seafood processing in the city of Portland and surrounding areas, as part of just one telephone survey, we found 700 employees, over half of them spoke a different language, came from a different country. So these jobs are important to our immigrant population. Our immigrant population is critical to the seafood economy. The lobster economy in Penobscot Bay depends on immigrant employment in the greater Portland area because that's where a lot of the processing happens. And without the immigrant employees that these firms have, that processing either goes someplace else, probably Canada, or it becomes much more expensive. And here they are. I mean, there's all white guys that look like me, working hard, splicing wire rope, but the packers at Bristol Seafood, that kid driving the forklift, the kid just breaks my heart. Every time I see him, I want to give him a job. Guy working on the Sugarfoot of Hagfish boat on Hobson's Wharf, checking his cell phone. These folks are what keep this economy rolling. As maritime professionals, you're mostly going to be on the water, but many of you are going to come on to land. And when you come on to land, you are going to be looking for employees. And if we don't serve the full variety of folks, we are not going, and if we don't include them in our economy, we are not going to have the employees necessary to do the work that you want to do. So back to sediment. Everything post-industrial and post-industrial time frame is dirty. Past industrial practices, past pesticide practices, the paints we used, the sewer treatment practices that we used, all of it resulted in dirty sediments sitting on top of post-glacial marine sediments. Dealing with that has been a barrier to economic development in Portland's waterfront for decades. It's really difficult to communicate what that means. This is just showing the incidence of different contaminants, and this is meaningless. You show this to a group of people like yourself, none of you understand what this means because I haven't described it to you, you haven't had a chance to absorb it. It's a terrible slide, but it is documentation that these contaminants exist. It's not the communication method that is going to win your argument, but you are going to get points for saying, yeah, we have some dirt, and that dirt needs to be disposed of in an appropriate way. Where does it exist? Where is your project? So the project that we're working on is actually looking to excavate out sediment from all of these orange areas: marinas, commercial berthing, transportation facilities, marine construction, and then put it into that confined aquatic disposal cell, the CAD cell, which is where the little blue star is, a big hole dumped in, dug into the harbor bottom. So in context, here is a portion of the inner part of Portland Harbor. The CAD cell site has got the little thumbtack on it, and the CAD cell, again, is confined aquatic disposal. Here's the location of it, looking from the Casco Bay Bridge. And what it is a hole. We need to dig a hole, a big hole, 9 acres in area, 50 feet deep, 379,000 cubic yards of material. For context, 10 cubic yards to a dump truck. So 37,000 dump trucks of material to come out so that we have a place for all of that material at the piers, wharves, marinas, ramps, and so forth. The image here is the actual sub-bottom profile of our CAD cell site, where good science went out, practitioners went out with scans, did hydrographic surveys that penetrated the harbor bottom, identified the strata of material, documenting that there was excavatable material so that it was a suitable site for a CAD cell. Essentially, can you dig it? And is it big enough? And is it stepped far enough away from channels and other marine infrastructure? So after finding the site and demonstrating that it was going to be usable, you then do design. And so this is the design of the CAD cell. This is a topographic map, and it's so rectangular because it's engineered. It's engineering design where you have 3-to-1 side slopes. So for every 1 foot of vertical distance that you go down, you have to have 3 feet of horizontal distance for stability. So you have a great deal of stability because of these gentle side slopes. And on the far side, away from me, that's the federal channel. And so we actually had to excavate in a channel to go in and dig out this massive hole. And we dig that out so we can then excavate and design dredges for the piers and wharves. And this is just one example. This is the Main State Pier in Portland Harbor. It's owned by the city of Portland. We use the 38-foot deep berth for cruise ship, tugboats, and lay berthing for transient vessels. And then we've got emergency vessels and Casco Bay ferries on the westerly side of the dock as well. And so these areas that are in orange are going to be dredged down to that design depth, which is what's in yellow. And in order to do that, then you come up with designs. This is a section drawing going through showing how much material, where the dashed line is the existing bottom and the bold black line would be the new bottom after dredging. The volume of material is everything that's on top of the black line. That's everything that goes into the CAD cell. And here is Cashman dredging. This is not the channel dredge. This was March in 2025, digging out the Ocean Gateway berth, getting ready to put it in the CAD cell. I was at the CAD cell site this morning to check out a post-construction. We dug it this winter, and we actually started filling it this winter. This was a 10-year project to get this done. And it has taken that long, partially because it is difficult to describe to people who are going to give you the money. They don't know what you know. They are not maritime professionals. What you come out of this school understanding is what the maritime industry and the maritime economy needs. Often, the folks who are going to be providing projects and infrastructure with the funding don't know what you know. And so it's important that you describe it to them in a way that is not patronizing, and in a way that is inclusive, but also informative. And one of the things that people don't get is just how big things can be. You need to describe scale. Photographs do a great job at that. That little guy standing on the top of that massive hopper scow does a good job of saying, yeah, these things are big. 5,000 cubic yards goes into that hopper. 5,000, that's 500 dump trucks in one load. People don't get it until you show them. And you need to show them in a way they're going to understand. And they understand pictures. If some of these pictures look compelling, that's because I've taken a bazillion pictures over the years and I save the good ones. Never throw away a good picture. Throw away all your bad ones. Learn to tell the difference. Because good photographs and clear communication are going to make your lives easier when you're going there with your hand out asking for money, and the person on the other side of that conversation has no idea of what you do for a living. You need to be able to describe it to them. Scale can be described in many different ways. It's always good to put a human in there. And it's also important to show relevance. People understand why the Coast Guard is important. If we didn't dredge out the Coast Guard berth, it's pretty easy to see what would happen. I was taking this picture from the CAD cell site, walking around at an extreme tide like we had this morning. Relevance. This ship may be delivering road salt to the Sprague facility in South Portland. I'm going to say that it is. Without road salt, we all know what happens to our roads in the wintertime. It's relevant. The fact that we can bring commodities such as salt into our town as opposed to having to truck them up from Portsmouth or from some other community means less traffic on the roads, more salt on the roads, less cost. Freight is relevant to the community, but only when you describe it to them and show them. And the geographic context. Show port activities within the context that people understand. That cruise ship operations and park activity can be compatible. That our commitment to marine infrastructure, this is Ocean Gateway in the city of Portland, our commitment to Ocean Gateway is part of a long-standing history of commitment to ocean activity, marine commerce, and marine infrastructure. The pilings that you see in the foreground are the old Grand Trunk Railroad that used to connect the Alberta wheat fields to the European grain market. And massive grain elevators served ocean-going vessels with gantries and transportation facility to get grain from the fields to the rails to the grain elevators to the ship to Europe. Ocean Gateway is a marine passenger facility. They're not the same, but to show the two within their context, to say, we've always done this. It's not new. We're a port community. Port communities invest in port infrastructure. And you need to connect that infrastructure to things that people understand. Downtown Portland in the background, Widgery Wharf and Union Wharf in the foreground. Quintessential lobster docks, the middle of downtown Portland. They're connected. Widgery Wharf is an extension of a street called Plum Street no longer exists. It used to be a street that ran from the city to the wharf. Many of Portland's piers and wharves are connected to the streets. Showing that connection makes people feel connected. The Ameskip vessels connect us to Northern Europe, as I described earlier. We are no longer the end of the line. Portland considered itself, Maine has considered itself the end of the line for way too long. It is through maritime commerce that we are gateways, not dead ends. And you need to describe that to people so that they understand. And you need to bring it back to humans. These guys kill me. They slay me every time I see them. I asked them if I could take their picture. They did not want me to take their picture. I asked again. They laughed. They said, sure. And now I pull them everywhere. They're compelling. They're working hard. They're doing an iconic job. They're enjoying themselves. And it lets people know why the lobster economy is important. These could be their neighbors. These guys, when we were looking at cold storage and the need for cold storage, and it's like one of the things we have to say, it's like, what happens to an economy that no longer welcomes the unwelcomed? If someone's coming out of incarceration, if someone is coming out of chemical dependency and is in recovery, someone has face tattoos, someone has a criminal record, what economy is going to welcome them back in and give them an alternative to either homelessness or crime? And it's often the waterfront. I don't know if any of these guys are still alive, but they were kind enough to let their picture be taken as publicity and public relations for the cold storage facility was underway back in 2016, 2017. And I have this post. I took the picture of this poster, which is above my desk. I look at it every day because I work for them. They need jobs. Their jobs support, they were working in the bait industry. That industry supports the lobster industry. That lobster industry supports a broader $3 billion seafood economy statewide. If not for dopey Skeezy and Doc here, we don't have a marine economy. We don't have a lobster economy. No bait, no lobster, no business. We need, I always come back to this kid, and I don't know why. But, I don't take that many good pictures. That's why I show the same ones over and over again. But he reminds me of my son. And if we're not going to do right by him, we're not going to be doing right by those pickers and these two, we're going to miss out because not only are we doing right by them, they are the future of the marine economy. Because without that kind of support service, this economy dries up and blows away. This guy kills me. I mean, don't get in his way. Do not get in his way. But what he's doing is, carrying on a legacy that I know goes back generations for him. And his entry into the marine economy was probably like breathing. Excuse me. Just going back. I just wanted to, well, we're going to go to questions, but what I want to say is, to wrap up, is that port planning is easier when the community sees itself in the port. And the port needs to see itself in the community. It needs to be an exchange, and when it is an exchange, you're able to develop those policies, develop the regulatory framework, and actually achieve some things. It's not easy, but it's doable. As maritime professionals, you carry the burden of describing marine activity to the land side because you know things that they don't. Happy to take questions.
And I could just keep listening to you tell stories. I'm sorry to have to stop. But I wanted to give folks a chance to ask questions if anybody has anything they would like to ask. Yes.
So I was just curious if you, like, I don't know, I'm from Portland or like very close to the area, and I was wondering if you guys work closely with the harbor masters in Portland?
Do we work closely with the harbor master in Portland? Absolutely. The harbor master is the staff for the Portland Harbor Commission. The Portland Harbor Commission was formed over 100 years ago by the legislature as a quasi-governmental agency that serves both Portland and South Portland. They do moorings, they do marine construction permits, and pilotage for the Port of Portland. And the Harbor Commission is actually our applicant for environmental permits for the dredge project. The City of Portland was the applicant for the CAD cell, the disposal site, but every project needs a leader. And the Harbor Commission has been the leader for permitting the piers, wharves, and marinas on both sides. And working with the harbor master, they are the everyday staff, day to day. And so Kevin Battle is the harbor master in Portland, and we work with Kevin, his assistants, Hattie trained to start working there. And without a functioning harbor master's office, our lives get a lot more difficult.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
What happens to all that dredge spoils? Does it go someplace on land, or does it get taken 200 miles offshore?
So when the contaminated materials that have accumulated around the piers and wharves will go into the contained aquatic disposal cell. The contained aquatic disposal cell material has tested clean enough for open water disposal. It goes to a licensed federal facility called the Portland Disposal Site. It's about 6 miles off Cape Elizabeth. And so we use the same site that the Army Corps developed for the disposal of channel dredge material. But only when that material is tested safe enough not to cause environmental damage through its deposition in the open ocean. And even then, only at very specific place. And that's all described within the permit.
Other questions?
The question is there a rail connection to cold storage? There's a rail connection to the International Marine Terminal, which is the container terminal. The loading platform for rail is at one edge. It's at the Commercial Street edge of the facility, so that the rail does not become an impediment to vehicle and box movement within the facility. So the cold storage facility and the container offload are both adjacent to and directly connected to the rail platform, but the rail platform is not in the middle of the facility. So yes, it is. It's not heavily used. The vast majority of these moves continue to happen by truck, and that's because moving into the national rail system to points south and west, there are too many low bridges and we can't double stack the containers, and so it's not efficient. It's not right now, it's not more efficient to move by rail than it is by truck. If we upgrade some of those bridges, we would probably turn that on its head. But by essentially halving the cost of rail transport by being able to double stack. We can't do it yet.
I have a question just maybe to wrap things up here, and it's thinking about in the process of doing the dredging work, what kinds of ecological monitoring need to be happen during the work? And I'm thinking about a lot of students here with a really strong focus in marine biology. What is the role for those kinds of studies in this type of a project?
So first in the permitting side of things, there's a great deal of ecological research that needs to be done, direct field work and observation of habitat and species assemblages within the impacted areas, essential fish habitat regulated through NOAA, and all of that is wrapped into both state and federal permits. And as part of those permits is requirement for monitoring. And there was 100% coverage for monitoring during this 24/7 dredge operation that we just concluded. And that was for both turbidity control, making sure that the water did not become too muddy during excavation and construction, and then also for marine mammals, turtles, and other potential impacts. We are fortunate that we're not sturgeon overwintering grounds in Portland Harbor. That would have been a problem for us as a protected species. But I met just this morning when we went on site, there was a woman who worked for Stantec Consulting, and she was the on-site observer for both monitoring and monitoring turbidity and endangered species. And she got to work with the crews. She said she felt very proud. She actually got one of the crew members to become interested in bird species while they were out there. They identified a blue-winged teal. She was pretty excited. But she was a marine biology major who's now working in the industry protecting marine species as part of dredge projects.
I love it. Well, we should probably wrap up for the next crew that's coming in, but round of applause, please. And thanks so much for coming, Bill.
Thank you.